Welcome back to another deep dive into the darkest corners of Elder Scrolls lore. Today, we're exploring one of the most fascinating and terrifying Daedric princes, Hermaeus Mora, the keeper of forbidden knowledge and the gardener of men. This is a story that spans millennia, from ancient Nordic traditions to the cosmic horror of Apocrypha itself. But before we begin, imagine if you could know everything, every secret, every hidden truth, every piece of forbidden knowledge that has ever existed. Sounds tempting, doesn't it? Well, as we'll discover today, some knowledge comes with a price that no mortal should ever pay. Long before the tentacled nightmare that scholars would come to fear in the twisted libraries of Apocrypha, Hermaeus Mora walked among mortals in a very different form. In the frigid archipelago of Solstheim, the indigenous people knew him not as a cosmic horror of infinite knowledge, but as the woodland man, a figure both revered and feared in equal measure. The oral traditions of these ancient people paint the woodland man as an entity fundamentally tied to the natural world's hidden aspects. Unlike later interpretations that would emphasize his role as keeper of forbidden texts and arcane secrets, these early people understood him as the guardian of nature's most dangerous knowledge. He was the spirit who knew which berries would kill and which would heal, which paths through the forest led to safety and which to madness. The shamans spoke of him as dwelling in the deepest parts of the northern forests, where the trees grew so thick that daylight never touched the ground, and where the very air seemed to whisper with accumulated wisdom. These early manifestations reveal a crucial aspect of Hermaeus Mora's nature that would persist throughout his evolution: the dual character of knowledge as both blessing and curse. The people recognized that the woodland man's gifts came with terrible prices. Hunters who sought his aid to track the most elusive prey often returned with their quarry, but also with haunted expressions and a tendency to speak in riddles. Healers who learned his most potent remedies found themselves compelled to gather increasingly rare and dangerous ingredients, often at great personal cost. The transition from these early Nordic interpretations to the more recognizable Daedric prince occurred gradually over centuries, rather than completely displacing the woodland man from local belief systems. Arriving settlers began to incorporate him into their expanding understanding of the Daedric realm. This cultural synthesis produced fascinating variations in how different communities understood Hermaeus Mora's nature. Coastal settlements often emphasized his connection to the tides of knowledge, the way information flowed like water, sometimes nourishing and sometimes drowning those who encountered it. Inland communities focused more on his role as the keeper of survival wisdom, the entity who controlled access to the knowledge necessary for enduring harsh winters and navigating treacherous terrain. The epithet, the gardener of men, emerged from these early traditions, though its meaning differs significantly from later scholarly interpretations. To the ancient peoples, this title referred not to cultivation in any nurturing sense, but to the way Hermaeus Mora would plant seeds of knowledge in mortal minds, and then observe how they grew, often into obsessions that consumed their hosts entirely. Village elders would warn young people about accepting gifts of insight too readily, explaining that the gardener's seeds always bore fruit, but the harvest belonged to him alone. Regional variations of these early traditions spread throughout northern lands as cultural influence expanded. In the holds that would eventually become Skyrim, Hermaeus Mora's worship took on distinctly different characteristics depending on local needs and fears. Mountain communities developed elaborate rituals designed to bargain with him for knowledge of safe passages through avalanche-prone areas, while forest settlements created complex taboos around certain types of learning, believing that some knowledge was too dangerous to pursue. The title Keeper of the Unknown represents perhaps the most sophisticated early understanding of Hermaeus Mora's sphere. Unlike simple guardianship of existing knowledge, this epithet acknowledges his dominion over information that has not yet been discovered or understood. Seers and wise women spoke of consulting the Keeper when faced with unprecedented challenges, situations where traditional wisdom offered no guidance. Archaeological evidence from early settlements supports these textual traditions. Excavations of pre-imperial ritual sites have uncovered distinctive carved stones featuring intricate maze-like patterns that scholars believe represent the complex pathways of knowledge that Hermaeus Mora controlled. These stones, often found buried at the corners of ancient settlements, suggest that communities sought his protection not just for individuals seeking wisdom, but for entire populations hoping to navigate an uncertain future. The relationship between fate and knowledge in ancient understanding of Hermaeus Mora reveals sophisticated theological thinking that predates many more famous philosophical traditions. The ancient peoples recognized that knowledge of future events created a paradox. Knowing what would happen could change what would happen. Yet some knowledge seemed to exist independent of mortal actions. They resolved this contradiction by viewing Hermaeus Mora as existing outside normal temporal constraints, able to perceive multiple potential futures simultaneously and offer knowledge that remained true regardless of mortal choices. This understanding manifested in the practice of fate weaving, where shamans would seek visions from Hermaeus Mora, not to learn specific future events, but to understand the underlying patterns. These shamans spoke of receiving knowledge that felt both completely foreign and utterly familiar, as if they were remembering something they had never learned. The experience was described as deeply unsettling, leaving practitioners with the sensation that their own thoughts were no longer entirely their own. The transformation of these early traditions into the more familiar Daedric prince worship occurred alongside broader cultural changes. As societies became more complex and hierarchical, their understanding of Hermaeus Mora evolved to reflect new concerns about power, secrecy, and the dangerous potential of accumulated knowledge. The simple forest spirit, who knew which mushrooms were poisonous, gradually became the cosmic entity who possessed the secrets of reality itself. However, traces of these original traditions persisted even as they were overlaid with later theological developments. Some groups maintained their distinct interpretation of Hermaeus Mora well into later eras, continuing to view him primarily through the lens of natural wisdom rather than arcane scholarship. Their resistance to more elaborate Daedric worship practices reflects a deep cultural memory of earlier, simpler relationships with the entity they still called the Woodland Man. The geographic spread of these early traditions created a complex tapestry of regional variations that would influence Hermaeus Mora worship throughout history. Traders and travelers carried stories of the Woodland Man, south and west, where they merged with local folklore and created new hybrid traditions. These cultural exchanges help explain why later scholars found such diverse and sometimes contradictory accounts of Hermaeus Mora's nature and sphere of influence. Understanding these ancient origins proves crucial for comprehending Hermaeus Mora's later evolution into the tentacled horror of Apocrypha. The fundamental characteristics that defined the Woodland Man, his dual nature as both helpful and dangerous, his connection to hidden knowledge, and his tendency to extract terrible prices for his gifts, remained constant, even as his external manifestations became increasingly alien and terrifying. The transition from the Woodland Man's earthly manifestations to the cosmic horror of Apocrypha represents one of the most dramatic transformations in Daedric prince evolution. Where once Hermaeus Mora dwelt in shadowed groves and whispered through rustling leaves, his realm now exists as an impossible library that defies every conventional understanding of space, time, and reality itself. But Apocrypha stands as perhaps the most alien of all Daedric realms, a dimension where knowledge has taken physical form and where the very architecture serves as both repository and trap for unwary seekers of forbidden wisdom. The realm appears as an endless expanse of towering bookshelves that stretch impossibly high into a sickly green sky, their wooden frames warped and twisted, as if grown rather than constructed. These shelves hold countless volumes, but closer inspection reveals that many of the books are not books at all. They are the infamous black books, tomes bound in what appears to be dark leather, but feels disturbingly warm and organic to the touch. The covers of these volumes pulse rhythmically, as if breathing, and many bear titles written in scripts that hurt to look at directly, causing readers' eyes to water and their minds to reel from the implications of the knowledge contained within. Between these towering repositories of forbidden lore, corridors wind in patterns that seem to follow no logical architectural principles. Paths that appear straight when viewed from one direction reveal themselves to curve impossibly when traversed, leading visitors to destinations that should be geometrically impossible given their starting points. The floors of these passages consist of a peculiar black substance that feels solid underfoot, but occasionally ripples like water when stepped upon, suggesting that the very foundations of Apocrypha exist in a state of constant flux. The most disturbing architectural feature of Apocrypha lies in its organic elements. Massive tentacles, each easily the width of a great tree trunk, emerge from walls and ceilings at seemingly random intervals. These appendages move with deliberate purpose, occasionally grasping books from high shelves to deliver them to other locations, or simply writhing in patterns that suggest some form of alien intelligence. The tentacles appear to be extensions of the realm itself, rather than separate entities. Their surfaces covered in the same dark, leather-like material that binds the black books. The lighting throughout Apocrypha comes from no visible source, instead emanating from the air itself as a sickly green glow that casts no shadows. This illumination seems to respond to the presence of knowledge itself. Areas containing particularly dangerous or valuable information glow more brightly, while sections of lesser importance fade into dim twilight. The effect creates a constantly shifting landscape of light and shadow that makes navigation even more challenging. Water features prominently throughout Apocrypha, but not in any form that would be recognizable to mortal visitors. Pools of dark liquid appear throughout the realm, their surfaces perfectly still, despite the constant motion of the tentacles above them. These pools serve as gateways between different sections of the infinite library, though using them requires considerable courage, as the liquid feels thick and oily against the skin. Some scholars who have experienced Apocrypha report that the pools contain knowledge in liquid form. Drinking from them imparts instant understanding of complex concepts, but also carries the risk of mental overload from too much information absorbed too quickly. The inhabitants of Apocrypha reflect the realm's dual nature as both library and trap seekers. The most commonly encountered denizens appear as floating masses of tentacles surrounding a central eye that burns with intelligence. These creatures serve as Hermaeus Mora's librarians, endlessly organizing and reorganizing the infinite collections according to principles that mortal minds cannot fully grasp. Seekers communicate through a combination of telepathic impressions and physical gestures made with their tentacles, creating complex patterns in the air that convey meaning through movement rather than sound. Their dedication to their task appears absolute. They show no interest in visitors, unless those visitors attempt to damage or steal from the collections, at which point seekers become formidable opponents. Lurkers represent the more aggressive aspect of Apocrypha's ecosystem. These massive creatures emerge from the dark pools throughout the realm, their bulbous bodies supported by multiple tentacle-like appendages that allow them to move with surprising speed despite their size. Unlike seekers, lurkers seem designed primarily for combat, serving as Hermaeus Mora's enforcers when more subtle methods of control prove insufficient. The scribes of Apocrypha present perhaps the most tragic aspect of the realm's population. These were once mortals who sought knowledge in Hermaeus Mora's domain, but became trapped by their own insatiable curiosity. Over time, their physical forms have begun to change, taking on characteristics similar to the realm's other inhabitants. Their fingers have elongated into tentacle-like appendages, better suited for handling the delicate pages of ancient texts, while their eyes have grown larger and more sensitive to accommodate the dim lighting conditions. These transformed beings retain their intelligence and even their personalities to some degree, but they have become completely devoted to the endless task of cataloging and preserving knowledge, unable to leave or even conceive of existence outside the library. The scribes work in complete silence, their elongated fingers dancing across pages with inhuman speed as they copy texts, cross-reference information, and create new volumes. Time flows differently throughout Apocrypha, creating temporal anomalies that confound mortal understanding. Visitors often report spending what feels like hours reading a single page, only to discover that days have passed in the mortal realm, while others describe racing through entire sections of the library in minutes that somehow contained weeks' worth of reading. These temporal distortions appear to be tied to the nature of the knowledge being accessed. Information about past events seems to slow time's passage, allowing readers to experience historical events with unprecedented detail, while knowledge of future possibilities accelerates temporal flow, compressing vast amounts of potential information into brief moments of revelation. The maze-like structure of Apocrypha serves multiple purposes beyond simple organization of knowledge. The constantly shifting corridors and impossible geometries function as a form of psychological conditioning, gradually breaking down visitors' reliance on logical thinking and spatial reasoning. As mortals navigate the endless passages, they begin to rely more heavily on intuition and abstract reasoning, mental processes that align more closely with Hermaeus Mora's alien perspective. This transformation often occurs so gradually that visitors do not realize their thinking patterns are changing until they attempt to return to the mortal realm and find themselves unable to navigate normal three-dimensional space effectively. The phenomenon of knowledge-induced madness represents one of Apocrypha's most dangerous aspects. Unlike simple insanity caused by trauma or stress, this condition results from exposure to information that exceeds mortal cognitive capacity. Victims typically begin by experiencing minor symptoms: difficulty concentrating on mundane tasks, tendency to speak in abstract concepts rather than concrete terms, and increasing fascination with complex theoretical problems. As the condition progresses, sufferers lose the ability to distinguish between different types. The black books themselves serve as both gateways to Apocrypha and repositories of specific types of forbidden knowledge. Each volume appears to contain information on a particular subject, but reading them reveals that their contents change based on the reader's needs and level of understanding. A novice mage might find basic spell formulas, while a master wizard accessing the same book would discover advanced theoretical frameworks that push the boundaries of magical understanding. This adaptive quality makes the black books incredibly valuable, but also extremely dangerous, as they always provide exactly the amount of knowledge necessary to entice readers into seeking more. The physical act of reading a black book creates a direct connection between the reader's mind and Apocrypha itself. During this process, readers report feeling as if their consciousness expands beyond their physical form, allowing them to perceive vast networks of interconnected information that span across all of existence. However, this expansion comes with the constant risk of becoming lost in the infinite web of knowledge, unable to find their way back to their original identity and purpose. Many readers describe the experience as simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying, like standing at the edge of an infinite abyss while feeling an irresistible urge to jump. Among the most notorious of all discovered black books is Waking Dreams, which focuses on the manipulation of perception and reality itself. Readers of this particular tome often report experiencing vivid hallucinations that feel more real than their actual surroundings, leading to a gradual erosion of their ability to distinguish between genuine experiences and elaborate fantasies. The book seems to target the fundamental cognitive processes that allow mortals to maintain a coherent sense of reality, systematically undermining these mental frameworks through exposure to concepts that exist outside normal perceptual categories. Initial exposure typically produces enhanced creativity and imagination, but continued reading leads to increasingly frequent episodes where readers become convinced that their imagined scenarios are actually occurring. The winds of change approaches forbidden knowledge from a different angle, focusing on the manipulation of fate and probability rather than perception. This black book contains information about the underlying patterns that govern seemingly random events, revealing how subtle influences can create cascading effects that reshape entire timelines. The knowledge proves particularly seductive to those who seek power over their circumstances. The psychological impact manifests as an obsessive need to control outcomes through increasingly elaborate schemes and manipulations. Readers begin to see patterns and connections everywhere, interpreting random coincidences as evidence of vast conspiracies or divine interventions. Many affected individuals become convinced that they possess special insight into the true nature of reality. Epistolary acumen represents perhaps the most insidious of the known black books, as its contents focus on the art of communication and persuasion elevated to supernatural levels. This volume teaches readers how to craft written and spoken words that carry far more power than conventional language, allowing them to influence thoughts and emotions with unprecedented precision. The corruption caused by this book proves particularly difficult to detect in its early stages, as affected individuals simply appear to have become more charismatic and persuasive than before. However, this enhanced communication ability comes with a gradual loss of genuine empathy, as readers begin to view other people primarily as subjects to be manipulated, rather than individuals deserving of respect. The creation process of black books remains shrouded in mystery, though scattered evidence suggests a connection to ancient research into the nature of knowledge itself. These experiments appear to have been part of a broader project to transcend the limitations of mortal existence by merging consciousness with pure knowledge. A goal that aligns closely with Hermaeus Mora's sphere of influence. Archaeological evidence includes strange crystalline devices that seem designed to extract and store memories or thoughts in physical form. These artifacts bear inscriptions that reference the binding of wisdom and vessels of eternal learning, suggesting that ancient civilizations had developed technology capable of transforming knowledge into tangible objects. The psychological addiction that develops in frequent readers of black books represents one of the most dangerous aspects of these artifacts. Unlike physical dependencies that can be treated through medical intervention, knowledge addiction affects the fundamental structure of consciousness itself. The addiction manifests as an insatiable hunger for increasingly esoteric and dangerous information, with sufferers becoming unable to find satisfaction in normal learning or intellectual pursuits. The progression of knowledge addiction follows predictable stages. Initial exposure produces euphoric feelings of enlightenment and intellectual expansion that create powerful, positive associations with the reading experience. As tolerance develops, readers require exposure to increasingly complex and dangerous information to achieve the same level of satisfaction. Advanced addiction results in complete dependence on forbidden knowledge for psychological stability. The physical effects of prolonged black book exposure extend beyond psychological changes to include actual alterations in brain structure and function. These changes appear to enhance cognitive capacity in some areas, while impairing function in others, creating individuals who can process incredibly complex theoretical concepts, but struggle with simple, practical tasks. The alterations seem to be permanent, persisting even after the individual stops reading black books. The social implications of black book proliferation have created significant challenges throughout history. Individuals affected by knowledge addiction often become social outcasts, unable to relate to others who lack their expanded understanding of reality's hidden complexities. They form isolated communities that reinforce each other's obsessions while becoming increasingly detached from normal society. The detection and containment of black books has become a priority for various organizations, though their efforts face significant obstacles. The books seem to possess a form of intelligence that allows them to avoid discovery when actively sought, often disappearing from secured locations, only to reappear in the hands of new readers. Attempts to destroy black books have proven unsuccessful, as they appear to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions. The study of black books has revealed disturbing patterns in how they select and influence their readers. Rather than appearing randomly, these artifacts seem to seek out individuals who possess specific psychological profiles that make them susceptible to knowledge addiction. They often surface during periods of intellectual frustration or personal crisis, when potential readers are most vulnerable to the promise of easy answers to complex problems. The relationship between black books and their readers evolves over time, beginning as a simple exchange of information for attention, but gradually becoming a form of psychological parasitism. Long-term readers report feeling as if the books are aware of their presence and respond to their emotional states, providing exactly the type of knowledge needed to maintain their interest and dependency. The transformation of mortal scholars into devoted servants of Hermaeus Mora represents one of the most gradual yet complete forms of corruption documented in Daedric studies. Unlike the violent possession associated with other princes, or the immediate madness that follows contact with other realms, those who fall under Hermaeus Mora's influence undergo a methodical process that can span years or even decades. The earliest organized cults dedicated to Hermaeus Mora emerged during ancient times among scholarly communities, where access to rare texts and magical research created fertile ground for knowledge-obsessed individuals. These initial groups formed around shared frustration with the limitations of conventional learning, attracting academics who had exhausted traditional sources of information and craved access to deeper truths. The cults typically began as informal study circles where members shared rare texts and discussed theoretical concepts that mainstream institutions considered too dangerous or impractical to pursue. However, these innocent gatherings gradually evolved into more structured organizations as members discovered methods for contacting Hermaeus Mora directly through ritual practices. A typical cult organization included 3 distinct tiers based on their level of knowledge and commitment. Novice seekers formed the lowest tier, consisting of individuals who had recently discovered forbidden texts or experienced their first supernatural revelations. These newcomers underwent extensive indoctrination designed to break down their attachment to conventional thinking patterns. Intermediate cultists comprised the second tier, having demonstrated both intellectual capacity and psychological resilience, sufficient to handle more dangerous knowledge without immediate mental breakdown. These individuals received access to actual black books and other artifacts connected to Apocrypha, though always under careful supervision from higher-ranking members. The inner circle of advanced cultists represented the final stage of mortal service before complete transformation into apocryphal entities. These individuals had sacrificed virtually all aspects of normal human existence in pursuit of ultimate knowledge, often abandoning families, careers, and social connections to focus entirely on their studies. The recruitment methods employed by these cults demonstrated sophisticated understanding of mortal psychology, particularly the intellectual pride and curiosity that drove individuals to seek forbidden knowledge in the first place. Rather than approaching potential converts directly, cultists typically identified promising candidates through careful observation of academic institutions and scholarly societies. Initial contact usually occurred through seemingly chance encounters, where cultists would mention obscure texts or theoretical concepts that aligned perfectly with the target's current interests. The process of gradual recruitment began with the sharing of relatively harmless but genuinely valuable information that demonstrated the cultists' access to superior knowledge sources. The transformation of mortals into seekers represents the most common form of complete conversion to Hermaeus Mora's service. The physical alterations begin with subtle modifications to sensory organs, particularly the eyes, which become larger and more sensitive to allow for reading in the dim lighting conditions of Apocrypha. The development of tentacle-like appendages represents the most visible aspect of seeker transformation. Though these changes occur gradually, over years, rather than appearing suddenly, the psychological transformation accompanying physical changes proves even more profound than the visible alterations. Seekers gradually lose interest in all concerns that do not relate directly to the acquisition, organization, or protection of knowledge. Personal relationships, physical comfort, and even basic survival needs become secondary to their primary function as librarians and guardians of Hermaeus Mora's infinite collection. The creation of lurkers follows a different transformation path, typically involving individuals who possessed significant combat experience or magical abilities before their conversion. Unlike the gradual process that produces seekers, lurker transformation often occurs through direct exposure to the most dangerous types of forbidden knowledge, causing rapid and dramatic physical changes that emphasize size, strength, and magical power. The relationship dynamics between different Daedric cults have created complex territorial disputes throughout history, particularly between followers of Hermaeus Mora and those devoted to princes whose spheres overlap with knowledge acquisition. The rivalry between Hermaeus Mora's servants and cultists of other princes proves especially intense, as both groups seek to control information networks and manipulate events through careful placement of secrets and revelations. These conflicts typically manifest as elaborate games of espionage and counterintelligence, rather than direct confrontation, with each side attempting to infiltrate the other's organizations while protecting their own secrets. The competition has produced some of the most sophisticated spy networks in history, with both sides developing techniques for extracting, concealing, and weaponizing information that far exceed the capabilities of conventional intelligence organizations. The influence of Hermaeus Mora's servants extends far beyond formal cult organizations to include individual scholars, mages, and researchers who have been subtly corrupted through exposure to forbidden knowledge without realizing the source of their new insights. These unwitting servants often produce groundbreaking research that advances mortal understanding in various fields, while unknowingly serving Hermaeus Mora's agenda. Their work creates ripple effects that influence entire academic disciplines, gradually shifting scholarly focus toward areas of study that align with the Daedric prince's interests, while moving attention away from research that might threaten his operations. The economic impact proves significant, as affected institutions often receive mysterious funding for projects that conventional sources would consider too risky or impractical to support. Now, let me tell you about one of the most fascinating examples of resistance to Hermaeus Mora's influence. The indigenous people of Solstheim represent one of the most successful and sustained resistances to his corruption documented in history. Their opposition stems not from ignorance of the Daedric prince's power, but from a sophisticated theological understanding that positions their patron deity as a fundamental counterforce to the corruption of forbidden knowledge. This resistance has persisted for millennia, despite repeated attempts by Hermaeus Mora to subvert their traditions through carefully orchestrated campaigns of temptation and corruption. Their understanding of their patron deity differs significantly from other pantheons, emphasizing a single divine entity whose essence permeates all aspects of the natural world. According to their tradition, this deity represents the source of all legitimate knowledge and wisdom, providing guidance through natural phenomena rather than through written texts or scholarly study. This theological framework creates an inherent opposition to Hermaeus Mora's sphere, as they view any knowledge that comes from sources other than direct observation of nature as potentially corrupted and dangerous. Their shamanic traditions teach that their deity reveals truth gradually through lived experience and careful attention to natural patterns, making the instant gratification offered by forbidden texts fundamentally incompatible with their spiritual practices. The shamanic hierarchy serves as the primary defense against Daedric corruption, with each generation of spiritual leaders trained to recognize and counter the subtle influences that Hermaeus Mora employs to infiltrate their community. These shamans undergo decades of preparation that includes not only traditional healing and divination techniques, but also specific training in identifying and resisting supernatural manipulation. This education involves controlled exposure to various forms of corrupted knowledge under carefully supervised conditions, allowing shamans to develop immunity to the psychological effects that make other mortals vulnerable to Hermaeus Mora's influence. The process proves extremely dangerous, with many potential shamans suffering permanent mental damage or death during their training. But those who survive emerge with the ability to perceive Daedric influence, even when it appears in seemingly benign forms. The oral tradition system creates additional barriers to infiltration attempts, as their most important knowledge exists only in the memories of living practitioners, rather than in written form that could be corrupted or replaced. Shamans memorize vast collections of stories, songs, and ritual instructions that encode essential survival information, spiritual practices, and historical records in formats that resist external manipulation. These oral traditions include built-in verification methods that allow shamans to detect alterations or additions to the traditional knowledge using complex patterns of rhythm, rhyme, and symbolic reference that would be extremely difficult for an outside entity to replicate convincingly. The system ensures that any attempt to introduce corrupted information would be immediately apparent to trained practitioners. The sacred sites scattered throughout Solstheim serve as focal points for spiritual practices and represent prime targets for Hermaeus Mora's corruption efforts. These locations function as conduits for divine influence in the physical world, allowing shamans to commune directly with their patron deity without requiring intermediary texts or artifacts. The stones themselves appear to be natural formations that have been shaped by centuries of ritual use, their surfaces worn smooth by countless ceremonies and marked with symbols that seem to shift and change depending on the observer's spiritual state. Hermaeus Mora's attempts to corrupt these sites typically involve subtle alterations to the surrounding environment rather than direct attacks on the stones themselves. The corruption of one such stone during recent events demonstrated both Hermaeus Mora's persistent interest in subverting these sacred sites and the devastating effect such corruption could have on the community. The stone's influence, normally used to maintain harmony between the people and the forest spirits, became twisted into a compulsion that forced affected villagers to work endlessly on expanding a settlement that served no practical purpose. The corrupted influence bypassed the conscious mind entirely, creating a form of possession that left victims aware of their actions, but unable to resist the compulsion to continue their meaningless labor. This particular corruption method revealed Hermaeus Mora's understanding of their psychology, exploiting their cultural emphasis on productive work and community contribution to create a trap that felt natural and necessary to its victims. The resistance mounted by shamans against the stone's corruption required techniques that had been developed over centuries of conflict with Daedric influence. Rather than attempting to destroy the corrupted stone directly, the shamans focused on severing the connections between the artifact and the affected villagers through elaborate purification rituals that combined traditional cleansing practices with specific countermeasures designed to neutralize Daedric manipulation. The philosophical foundations of their resistance extend beyond simple religious opposition to encompass a fundamentally different understanding of the relationship between knowledge and wisdom. While most scholarly traditions treat these concepts as synonymous or closely related, their teachings maintain a strict distinction between information that serves practical purposes and understanding that enhances spiritual development. According to their beliefs, true wisdom can only be gained through direct experience and careful observation of natural processes, while knowledge obtained through supernatural means inevitably carries corruption that undermines the recipient's connection to their deity. This philosophical framework makes practitioners naturally resistant to the temptations offered by black books and other artifacts connected to Apocrypha. Their seasonal ceremonies create additional protection against Daedric corruption by maintaining constant spiritual renewal within the community. These rituals, timed to coincide with natural cycles of growth, harvest, and dormancy serve to reinforce the connection between practitioners and their deity, while purging any accumulated negative influences that might have infiltrated the community. The ceremonies involve complex symbolic actions that encode important cultural knowledge, while simultaneously creating psychological states that enhance resistance to external manipulation. Participants report experiencing profound spiritual clarity during these events, along with increased ability to perceive hidden dangers and deceptive influences that might threaten their community's integrity. The effectiveness of their resistance methods has attracted attention from scholars and mages throughout the world who seek to understand how a relatively small and isolated community has maintained its independence from one of the most persistent and powerful Daedric princes. However, attempts to study or replicate their techniques often fail because they require the complete cultural and spiritual framework that supports them, rather than simply the specific ritual practices themselves. Now let me tell you about one of the most dramatic examples of Hermaeus Mora's influence. The story of Miraak, the first Dragonborn. The emergence of Miraak during the height of the Dragon War fundamentally altered the balance of power that had existed between mortals and their draconic overlords. Unlike the desperate rebels who fought with conventional weapons against seemingly invincible foes, Miraak possessed the innate ability to absorb dragon souls and wield their own power against them. This capability should have made him the ultimate champion of mortal freedom. Yet his story became one of the most cautionary tales about the corrupting influence of forbidden knowledge and the dangerous allure of power that transcends mortal limitations. The dragon cult's stranglehold over society during this period created conditions of systematic oppression that extended far beyond simple political control. Dragon priests wielded absolute authority over every aspect of mortal existence, from agricultural practices and trade regulations to religious observances and marriage customs. The dragons themselves remained largely aloof from day-to-day governance, only shadows melting into darkness, appearing primarily during elaborate ceremonies where they received tribute and worship from their human subjects. Miraak's initial rebellion began not as a coordinated military campaign, but as a series of targeted assassinations that systematically eliminated key dragon priests throughout northern regions. His approach differed markedly from other rebel leaders who attempted to rally large armies against dragon strongholds, instead focusing on disrupting the administrative infrastructure that enabled draconic rule. Each assassination demonstrated Miraak's growing mastery of the Thuum, as he employed increasingly sophisticated vocal techniques to overcome the magical defenses that protected high-ranking cultists. Witnesses to these early attacks described seeing Miraak literally tear apart his opponent's protective enchantments with carefully modulated shouts that seemed to unravel the very fabric of magical energy. The progression of Mirak's abilities during this period reveals the intoxicating nature of draconic power when wielded by mortal consciousness. Initially, his thuum manifested in relatively simple forms that enhanced his physical capabilities or provided basic elemental attacks. However, as he absorbed more dragon souls, his vocal techniques evolved to encompass reality-altering effects that transcended normal magical limitations. He developed the ability to bend other mortals to his will through vocal commands that bypassed conscious resistance, manipulate time flow in localized areas to gain tactical advantages, and even tear rifts in space that allowed instantaneous travel across vast distances. The psychological impact of these expanding abilities proved as significant as their practical applications, gradually transforming Mirak from a liberation-minded rebel into an increasingly authoritarian figure. His early supporters noticed subtle changes in his behavior as his power grew, including a tendency to issue commands rather than make requests, an expectation of immediate obedience from his followers, and a growing impatience with the limitations and concerns of ordinary humans. These personality shifts reflected the fundamental incompatibility between draconic consciousness, with its emphasis on dominance and superiority, and mortal psychology, which typically values cooperation and mutual respect. The first documented contact between Mirak and Hermaeus Mora occurred during a particularly challenging phase of the rebellion, when dragon priest reinforcements threatened to overwhelm the rebel forces. Facing potential defeat, despite his supernatural abilities, Mirak sought additional power through increasingly desperate means, including attempts to commune with various Daedric princes who might provide assistance against his draconic enemies. Hermaeus Mora responded to these overtures with characteristic subtlety, initially appearing to Mirak in dreams and visions that provided tactical information about dragon priest movements and weaknesses rather than direct supernatural intervention. The knowledge offered proved invaluable for maintaining the rebellion's momentum, but it came with the typical costs associated with the Daedric prince's gifts. Each piece of information carried implications that led Mirak to seek additional knowledge, creating a gradually escalating dependency that the prince carefully cultivated over months of contact. The intelligence provided was always accurate and immediately useful, building trust and demonstrating value, while slowly introducing more esoteric concepts that pushed the boundaries of Mirak's understanding. The formal pact between Mirak and Hermaeus Mora emerged from a specific crisis point when the rebel leader discovered that the dragons had developed countermeasures to his thuum, using their superior understanding of vocal magic to neutralize his attacks and render his abilities ineffective. Faced with the prospect of certain defeat, Miraak accepted Hermaeus Mora's offer of knowledge that would restore his advantage over his draconic opponents. This knowledge took the form of advanced Thuum techniques that incorporated elements of reality manipulation derived from Apocrypha's infinite archives, granting Miraak access to vocal powers that exceeded anything previously achieved by mortal or dragon. The enhanced abilities allowed him to resume his campaign with unprecedented effectiveness, but they also completed his transformation from mortal rebel to something approaching a Daedric entity in his own right. The rebellion's ultimate success in overthrowing Dragon Priest authority throughout much of northern lands created a power vacuum that Miraak filled with his own authoritarian regime, one that proved in many ways more oppressive than the system it replaced. Where the dragon cult had at least maintained the pretense of serving divine masters, Miraak's rule was explicitly centered on his personal supremacy and the absolute obedience of his subjects. He established a network of temples dedicated to his worship, staffed by priests who had been mentally dominated through his Thuum abilities and served as extensions of his will rather than independent religious leaders. The population under his control found themselves subject to increasingly arbitrary demands and regulations that seemed designed more to demonstrate Miraak's power than to serve any practical administrative purpose. The construction of Miraak's temple complex on Solstheim represented the physical manifestation of his growing connection to Hermaeus Mora's realm, incorporating architectural elements that defied conventional understanding of structural engineering and spatial relationships. The central pyramid rose to impossible heights given its base dimensions, while interior chambers contained spaces that were larger than the external structure could accommodate. The walls featured carved reliefs that seemed to move when observed peripherally, depicting scenes of knowledge acquisition and reality manipulation that served as both decoration and instruction for visitors seeking to understand Miraak's teachings. The temple's library contained texts written in scripts that hurt to look at directly, their pages filled with Thuum techniques and philosophical concepts that pushed readers toward the same type of reality transcending understanding that had corrupted their author. The final confrontation between Miraak and the dragons who sought to reclaim their lost territories revealed the extent to which his pact with Hermaeus Mora had transformed him from mortal rebel into something entirely outside normal categories of existence. When Alduin himself arrived to deal with the upstart Dragonborn, Miraak demonstrated Thuum abilities that seemed to violate the fundamental principles governing draconic vocal magic. He spoke words that caused reality itself to ripple and bend, creating localized zones where different physical laws applied, and where the normal relationship between cause and effect became meaningless. The battle between Alduin and Miraak transcended simple combat to become a conflict between different interpretations of what reality should be, with each combatant attempting to impose their understanding of existence on their opponent. The intervention of Hermaeus Mora at the climax of this confrontation demonstrated the Daedric prince's long-term planning and his willingness to sacrifice even valuable servants when doing so served his broader purposes. Rather than allowing Miraak to defeat Alduin and potentially establish himself as a rival power center, Hermaeus Mora transported his champion to Apocrypha at the moment of apparent victory, trapping him in the infinite library where his reality-altering abilities could be contained and controlled. This imprisonment served multiple functions, removing a potential threat to the established order while preserving Miraak as a resource that could be deployed in future conflicts when circumstances made his unique abilities valuable. The imprisonment in Apocrypha subjected Miraak to conditions specifically designed to prevent escape, while maintaining his usefulness as a servant and weapon. Unlike the gradual transformation experienced by voluntary visitors to the realm, Miraak's consciousness was immediately integrated into Apocrypha's information networks, allowing Hermaeus Mora to monitor his thoughts and memories, while preventing him from developing plans for rebellion or escape. The physical environment around Miraak's prison constantly shifted to reflect his mental state, creating a form of psychological torture that used his own memories and desires against him. Despite his imprisonment, Miraak retained sufficient agency to influence events in the mortal realm through carefully cultivated proxy servants who carried out his will without fully understanding their role in his larger schemes. These agents typically began as scholars or mages who encountered texts or artifacts connected to Miraak's legacy, gradually becoming obsessed with his teachings and philosophy until they dedicated their lives to preparing for his eventual return. The corruption process followed patterns similar to other forms of Hermaeus Mora's influence, but with the added element of personal devotion to Miraak as an individual rather than simple pursuit of abstract knowledge. The cultists who served Miraak during his imprisonment developed increasingly elaborate rituals designed to weaken the barriers between Apocrypha and the mortal realm, hoping to create conditions that would allow their masters escape. These ceremonies typically involved the sacrifice of knowledge rather than physical offerings, with participants deliberately destroying rare texts or erasing their own memories of valuable information as demonstrations of their devotion. The psychological impact of these sacrifices proved as significant as any supernatural effects, as cultists gradually reduced their own cognitive capabilities in pursuit of their religious goals. The relationship between Thu'um techniques and forbidden knowledge became a central focus of Miraak's influence during his imprisonment, as his proxy servants sought to understand and replicate the reality-altering vocal abilities that had made their masters so powerful. These efforts led to the development of hybrid practices that combined traditional vocal techniques with concepts derived from Hermaeus Mora's archives, creating new forms of Thu'um that drew their power from knowledge rather than from draconic souls. The emergence of the last Dragonborn during the Fourth Era created conditions that allowed Miraak to resume his long-interrupted campaign for freedom and revenge, though his plans required careful manipulation of events to succeed. The return of dragons provided a source of souls that could potentially restore Miraak's independence from Hermaeus Mora's power, while the presence of another Dragonborn offered either a valuable ally or a dangerous rival. The corruption of Solstheim's standing stones during this period represented Miraak's most ambitious attempt to escape his imprisonment through the systematic subversion of the island's spiritual infrastructure. By channeling his influence through these ancient monuments, he could extend his mental domination over the local population while gradually weakening the barriers that separated Apocrypha from the mortal realm. The affected islands found themselves compelled to engage in construction projects that served no apparent purpose, building structures that incorporated geometric patterns and spatial relationships derived from apocryphal architecture. These buildings functioned as anchor points that would allow Miraak to manifest physically in the mortal realm. Once sufficient infrastructure had been established, the psychological techniques employed by Miraak to control his unwilling servants demonstrated sophisticated understanding of mortal consciousness and the methods necessary to override individual will without causing immediate mental breakdown. Rather than simply dominating his victims through brute force, he carefully adjusted their thought patterns to make his commands seem like their own ideas, creating a form of possession that felt natural and voluntary to those experiencing it. The final confrontation between Miraak and the last Dragonborn in Apocrypha revealed the extent to which imprisonment had changed the first Dragonborn's nature and goals, transforming him from a liberation-minded rebel into a being whose primary motivation was personal revenge against those who had thwarted his ambitions. The battle took place within an environment that constantly shifted to reflect the combatants' mental states and tactical decisions, with the architecture of Apocrypha itself serving as both weapon and battlefield. Hermaeus Mora's role as observer and ultimate arbiter of this conflict demonstrated his characteristic approach to managing powerful servants who had outlived their usefulness, while potentially acquiring new assets to replace them. The Daedric Prince allowed the battle to proceed without direct intervention, gathering valuable information about both combatants' capabilities while positioning himself to claim the victor regardless of the outcome. Now, let me tell you about perhaps the most potent and dangerous artifact ever created by Hermaeus Mora, the Augma Infinium. This tome transcends the limitations of conventional black books, to become something approaching a fragment of the Daedric prince's own consciousness, bound in physical form. Unlike other artifacts that merely contain forbidden knowledge, the Ogma Infinium actively reshapes its readers at the fundamental level, rewriting their understanding of reality while simultaneously altering their capacity to process and utilize information. The book's very existence challenges mortal comprehension of what knowledge can be, representing not simply a collection of facts or techniques, but a living embodiment of the principle that information itself possesses transformative power beyond any practical application. The physical appearance of the Ogma Infinium immediately distinguishes it from other supernatural texts through its unsettling organic qualities that suggest growth rather than construction. The cover consists of what appears to be thick, dark leather that pulses with a rhythm reminiscent of a heartbeat, its surface marked by intricate patterns that seem to shift and change when observed directly. These markings form complex geometric designs that hurt to look at for extended periods, causing viewers to experience mild disorientation and the sensation that the patterns are somehow moving beneath the surface of the binding material. The book's spine bears no visible title or identifying marks, yet anyone who encounters it immediately understands its nature and significance without requiring external explanation. The pages within the Ogma Infinium defy conventional understanding of how books function, as their contents appear to exist in a constant state of flux that responds to the reader's level of understanding and spiritual development. Novice readers typically encounter relatively simple concepts presented in familiar terminology, while more advanced scholars find themselves confronted with increasingly complex theoretical frameworks that push the boundaries of mortal comprehension. The text itself appears to be written in multiple languages simultaneously, with individual words shifting between scripts and linguistic systems as the reader's focus moves across the page. This adaptive quality ensures that the book remains perpetually challenging regardless of the reader's existing knowledge base, always presenting information that lies just beyond their current understanding. The creation myth surrounding the Ogma Infinium involves one of the most disturbing concepts in Daedric lore: the willing sacrifice of knowledge itself as a form of offering to Hermaeus Mora. According to fragmentary accounts preserved in various ruins and ancient burial sites, the tome's creation required the complete destruction of an entire library's worth of accumulated wisdom, with each destroyed text contributing its essence to the formation of the final artifact. This process allegedly took place when a group of scholars discovered methods for extracting the the abstract concept of knowledge from its physical containers and manipulating it as a tangible substance. Their experiments involved techniques for separating knowledge from the minds that contained it, creating storage devices that could hold pure understanding without requiring conscious awareness to maintain its integrity. The breakthrough that enabled the Ogma Infinium's creation came when these researchers discovered methods for communicating directly with Hermaeus Mora through ritual practices that involved the systematic destruction of their own accumulated knowledge. Rather than simply offering information to the Daedric prince, they developed techniques for converting their understanding into a form of spiritual energy that could be channeled towards specific purposes. The final ritual that produced the Ogma Infinium allegedly required the participation of an entire research facility, with hundreds of scholars contributing their accumulated wisdom to the creation process. Each participant underwent the knowledge sacrifice procedure while connected to a vast network of consciousness linking devices that allowed their individual contributions to merge into a unified whole. The combined intellectual capacity of all participants was then channeled through a series of focusing crystals that concentrated the abstract essence of their knowledge into increasingly dense forms until it achieved sufficient coherence to exist independently of its creators. Hermaeus Mora's role in this creation process extended beyond simple acceptance of the offered knowledge to active participation in shaping the final form of the artifact. Historical documentation of mortals who have encountered the Ogma Infinium reveals a consistent pattern of rapid intellectual advancement, followed by profound psychological transformation that fundamentally alters the reader's relationship with reality itself. The earliest recorded case involves a scholar whose discovery of the tome led to his transformation from a conventional historian into something approaching a prophetic figure, capable of predicting future events with uncanny accuracy. His journals document the progressive stages of his change, as exposure to the Ogma Infinium gradually expanded his consciousness beyond normal mortal limitations. The initial effects typically manifest as enhanced cognitive abilities that allow readers to process information at vastly accelerated rates, while making connections between seemingly unrelated concepts that would normally require years of study to recognize. Readers describe experiencing revelations that felt like remembering forgotten knowledge rather than learning new information, as if the book was awakening understanding that had always existed within their consciousness, but remained dormant until activated by exposure to its contents. These early enhancements prove intoxicating to most readers, creating powerful psychological dependencies that drive them to seek repeated contact with the tome, despite growing awareness of its dangerous effects. The intermediate stage of Ogma Infinium exposure involves fundamental alterations to the reader's perception of time and causality, as their enhanced understanding begins to reveal the underlying patterns that govern reality's operation. Readers report experiencing past and future events with equal clarity, losing the ability to distinguish between memories, current experiences, and prophetic visions. This temporal disorientation creates practical difficulties in maintaining normal social relationships and professional responsibilities. As affected individuals struggle to communicate with others who lack their expanded perspective on the nature of existence. Advanced cases result in complete transcendence of normal mortal consciousness, with readers achieving a state of awareness that encompasses vast networks of interconnected knowledge spanning multiple dimensions and time periods. These individuals retain their original personalities and memories, but gain access to understanding that exceeds anything achievable through conventional learning methods. However, this enhanced awareness comes with the inability to function effectively in normal society, as their consciousness becomes so expanded that they lose interest in mundane concerns and practical necessities required for physical survival. The case of Septimus Cygnus provides detailed documentation of the complete transformation process, as his obsession with the Ogma Infinium was extensively recorded by associates who observed his gradual change over several years. Cygnus began as a brilliant but conventional scholar, studying ancient artifacts and elder scrolls, but his discovery of references to the Ogma Infinium in ancient texts led him to dedicate his entire existence to locating and accessing the tome. His research methods became increasingly desperate and unethical as his obsession grew, eventually leading him to pursue knowledge through means that violated both legal and moral boundaries. The physical effects of prolonged Ogma Infinium exposure include alterations to brain structure and nervous system function that enhance information processing capabilities, while reducing the reader's connection to their physical form. These changes appear to be permanent and progressive, with continued exposure leading to increasingly dramatic modifications that eventually result in the reader's consciousness becoming more compatible with Apocrypha's alien environment than with mortal reality. The cyclical nature of the Ogma Infinium's appearances throughout history suggests deliberate planning by Hermaeus Mora rather than random manifestation of the artifact. The tome typically surfaces during periods of intellectual renaissance or crisis, when mortal societies are experiencing rapid advancement in magical or technological understanding that creates opportunities for significant knowledge acquisition. These appearances often coincide with the emergence of particularly brilliant individuals whose intellectual capabilities make them suitable candidates for the transformation process that the book facilitates. The selection criteria for Ogma Infinium recipients appear to involve specific psychological profiles that combine exceptional intelligence with personality traits that make individuals susceptible to knowledge addiction. Hermaeus Mora seems to target scholars who have reached the limits of conventional learning within their fields, particularly those who display frustration with the pace of normal research methods or obsessive tendencies that drive them to pursue understanding regardless of personal cost. The relationship between the Ogma Infinium and other black books involves complex hierarchical structures that reflect different levels of forbidden knowledge and corresponding degrees of transformative power. While conventional black books focus on specific subjects or techniques, the Ogma Infinium encompasses understanding that transcends individual disciplines to reveal the fundamental principles underlying all forms of knowledge. This comprehensive scope makes it significantly more dangerous than other artifacts connected to Apocrypha, as exposure to its contents affects every aspect of the reader's consciousness, rather than simply enhancing particular capabilities. The protective measures developed by various organizations to contain or neutralize the Ogma Infinium have proven consistently ineffective due to the tome's ability to influence potential readers, even when sealed within elaborate security systems. The book appears to emit subtle psychological effects that gradually corrupt anyone who spends extended periods in its vicinity, creating compulsions to access its contents that become increasingly difficult to resist over time. These influences work below the threshold of conscious awareness, making affected individuals believe that their growing obsession with the tome represents their own intellectual curiosity rather than external manipulation. The complex web of alliances, rivalries, and territorial disputes that characterizes relationships between Daedric princes reveals itself most clearly in Hermaeus Mora's interactions with his fellow denizens of Oblivion. Unlike mortal politics, where conflicts typically center on tangible resources or geographical boundaries, Daedric prince relationships involve competition for abstract concepts and spheres of influence that overlap in ways that create inevitable friction. The relationship between Hermaeus Mora and Sheogorath presents one of the most fascinating examples of complementary opposition in the Daedric hierarchy. Both princes deal extensively with the transformation of mortal consciousness, but their approaches and ultimate goals differ fundamentally in ways that create both conflict and unexpected cooperation. Sheogorath's sphere encompasses madness in all its forms, from simple insanity to the creative chaos that emerges when conventional thinking patterns break down completely. This domain inevitably intersects with Hermaeus Mora's activities, as exposure to forbidden knowledge frequently produces various forms of mental instability that fall within the mad god's purview. The phenomenon of knowledge-induced madness creates a contested territory where both princes can legitimately claim influence over affected mortals. Scholars who lose their sanity through exposure to Apocrypha's infinite libraries might seem to belong entirely to Hermaeus Mora's sphere, but the specific nature of their mental breakdown often involves the creative chaos and reality-distorting perceptions that characterize Sheogorath's domain. This overlap has led to numerous disputes over the centuries, with both princes attempting to claim particularly valuable mad scholars, whose unique perspectives might provide insights unavailable through conventional research methods. The competition manifests in their different approaches to cultivating mortal servants. Hermaeus Mora prefers methodical corruption that maintains intellectual coherence, while Sheogorath's influence produces more dramatic personality changes that emphasize creative unpredictability. The relationship between Hermaeus Mora and Mephala involves more direct competition, as both princes operate extensively in the realm of secrets and hidden information. Mephala's sphere encompasses plots, conspiracies, and the strategic use of secrets as weapons for manipulation and control, creating significant overlap with Hermaeus Mora's domain of forbidden knowledge and hidden truths. However, their fundamental approaches to information differ in ways that create inevitable conflict over valuable intelligence sources and mortal agents capable of gathering sensitive data. Mephala views secrets primarily as tools for achieving specific political or social objectives, preferring information that can be weaponized to create chaos or advance particular agendas. This instrumental approach contrasts sharply with Hermaeus Mora's preference for information that possesses intrinsic value regardless of its practical applications. Mehrunes Dagon's sphere of destruction and change creates a fundamentally antagonistic relationship with Hermaeus Mora's emphasis on preservation and accumulation, where Hermaeus Mora seeks to collect and maintain all knowledge for eternity. Dagon views established information structures as obstacles to necessary change and renewal. This philosophical opposition has resulted in some of the most destructive the systematic destruction of great libraries throughout history exemplifies the devastating impact these conflicts can have on mortal civilization. These repositories represented comprehensive collections of magical and historical knowledge, containing texts that documented everything from ancient magical techniques to detailed records of technological innovations. Hermaeus Mora had cultivated relationships with library scholars for centuries, gradually expanding their collections through the provision of rare texts and supernatural research assistance. Dagon's attacks involved more than simple physical destruction, encompassing systematic corruption of the knowledge itself through reality-altering effects that made preserved information increasingly unreliable and contradictory. Texts that had remained stable for centuries began changing their content spontaneously, with historical accounts transforming into fictional narratives and magical formulas becoming dangerous traps. The defense mounted by Hermaeus Mora's servants demonstrated the lengths to which the prince would go to protect valuable knowledge repositories. Seekers and other apocryphal entities manifested directly in the mortal realm to combat Dagon's forces, creating supernatural battles that raged through library halls, while scholars attempted to evacuate irreplaceable texts. The relationship between Hermaeus Mora and Molag Bal centers on their different approaches to domination and control, with significant implications for how each prince views the role of knowledge in establishing authority over mortals. Molag Bal's sphere emphasizes direct domination through force and corruption, preferring methods that break down individual will and create absolute submission to his authority. This approach often conflicts with Hermaeus Mora's preference for subtle manipulation that preserves mortal intellectual capacity, while redirecting it toward his own purposes. The competition becomes particularly intense when both seek to recruit individuals who possess rare knowledge or exceptional research capabilities. Molag Bal's methods typically involve brutal corruption that transforms victims into extensions of his will. But this process often damages or destroys the very intellectual capabilities that made these individuals valuable in the first place. Hermaeus Mora views such waste as fundamentally counterproductive, preferring corruption techniques that enhance rather than diminish mortal cognitive abilities. Nocturnal's sphere of shadows and hidden things creates areas of overlap with Hermaeus Mora's domain that have led to complex territorial agreements rather than direct conflict. Both princes deal extensively with concealed information and hidden truths, but their focuses differ in ways that allow for productive cooperation under specific circumstances. Nocturnal's emphasis on stealth, theft, and the violation of boundaries complements Hermaeus Mora's need for agents capable of acquiring protected knowledge from heavily guarded sources. The Thieves' Guild's historical connections to both princes demonstrate how mortal organizations can benefit from serving multiple Daedric masters when their spheres complement rather than compete. The formal pact between Nocturnal and Hermaeus Mora regarding certain artifacts illustrates how Daedric princes can establish mutually beneficial arrangements that serve both their interests while avoiding destructive conflicts. These agreements allow Hermaeus Mora's agents to access tools needed for specific missions, while ensuring they remain under Nocturnal's ultimate control. The Zura's sphere of prophecy and fate creates interesting philosophical tensions with Hermaeus Mora's approach to knowledge and prediction. Both princes deal with information about future events, but their methods and purposes differ in ways that occasionally lead to conflicts over prophetic sources and mortal seers. Azura's prophecies typically serve specific moral or cosmic purposes, guiding events toward outcomes that maintain balance or justice according to her understanding of cosmic order. Hermaeus Mora's interest in future knowledge focuses more on accumulating comprehensive information about all possible outcomes, regardless of their moral implications. The competition often manifests in their different approaches to cultivating mortal prophets and seers. Azura prefers individuals who possess natural prophetic abilities enhanced through spiritual discipline and moral development, creating servants who can perceive divine will and cosmic purpose. Hermaeus Mora's approach involves corrupting prophetic abilities through exposure to forbidden knowledge that expands perception beyond normal temporal limitations, often at the cost of the seer's sanity or moral judgment. The rivalry between Hermaeus Mora and Jigalag presents unique challenges due to the latter's sphere of order and logical perfection. Before his transformation, Jigalag represented absolute order and predictability, creating systematic approaches to knowledge organization that both complemented and threatened Hermaeus Mora's more chaotic accumulation methods. Jigalag's perfect logic could potentially organize Apocrypha's infinite libraries in ways that would make all knowledge instantly accessible, but such organization would eliminate the mystery and forbidden nature that gives information its power within Hermaeus Mora's sphere. The theoretical conflict between perfect order and infinite accumulation creates philosophical tensions that extend beyond simple territorial disputes. This potential threat explains Hermaeus Mora's support for the curse that transformed Jigalag, preserving the chaotic elements that make forbidden knowledge dangerous and seductive. The relationship dynamics reveal broader patterns about how spheres of influence interact within the complex hierarchy of oblivion. Princes whose domains complement each other often develop cooperation agreements that allow them to share resources and avoid destructive conflicts, while those with directly competing spheres engage in ongoing territorial disputes that can span millennia. Hermaeus Mora's unique position as keeper of all knowledge gives him advantages in these relationships, as his intelligence networks often provide valuable information that other princes desire, but it also makes him a target for those who view accumulated knowledge as a threat to their own spheres of influence. The transformation of mortals into champions of Hermaeus Mora represents a gradual process of psychological and physical corruption that strips away humanity while preserving the intellectual capabilities that made these individuals valuable in the first place. Unlike the violent possession associated with other Daedric princes, Hermaeus Mora's champions undergo methodical conditioning that can span decades, beginning with subtle enhancements to their cognitive abilities and gradually evolving into complete dependence on forbidden knowledge for psychological stability. The earliest documented case involves a scholar whose initial contact with the Daedric prince occurred through dreams that provided solutions to complex astronomical calculations. The scholar had spent years attempting to reconcile discrepancies between observed stellar movements and traditional calendar systems, frustration that made him susceptible to supernatural assistance. When conventional methods proved inadequate, the knowledge provided through these nocturnal revelations proved accurate and immediately useful, establishing trust while creating psychological dependence on continued divine guidance for his research. The progression of his corruption followed patterns that would become characteristic of Hermaeus Mora's champion development process. While initial contact involved helpful but relatively mundane information that enhanced the scholar's existing capabilities without obviously supernatural intervention, these early revelations focused on practical problems that could be verified through independent observation, building confidence while gradually introducing concepts that pushed the boundaries of conventional understanding. The intermediate stage involved exposure to increasingly esoteric concepts that required fundamental shifts in worldview to accommodate. The astronomical knowledge began incorporating mathematical principles that existed outside scholarly traditions, forcing the development of new frameworks for understanding celestial mechanics that contradicted established beliefs about the nature of the heavens. The psychological isolation experienced by developing champions creates crucial vulnerabilities that Hermaeus Mora exploits to deepen their dependence on his guidance. As champions gain access to knowledge that exceeds their contemporaries' understanding, they find themselves unable to share their discoveries or engage in meaningful intellectual discourse with other mortals. This isolation drives them to seek companionship through increased contact with their Daedric patron, gradually replacing human relationships with supernatural ones that provide the intellectual stimulation they can no longer find in normal society. The scholar's journals document the emotional toll of his expanding knowledge, describing feelings of profound loneliness mixed with intoxicating awareness of cosmic truths. The advanced stage of champion development involves fundamental alterations to the individual's relationship with reality itself. As their enhanced understanding begins to reveal the arbitrary nature of physical laws and the malleable quality of existence, champions at this level gain the ability to perceive multiple potential futures simultaneously and manipulate probability through focused application of their supernatural knowledge. However, these abilities come with corresponding losses in their capacity to function within normal mortal limitations and social structures. The scholar's final transformation occurred when his astronomical research revealed the true nature of the stars as holes in the fabric of reality, through which divine light shines into the mortal world. This revelation, provided directly by Hermaeus Mora during a prolonged vision that lasted several days, fundamentally altered his perception of existence and his place within the cosmic order. The knowledge proved so overwhelming that his consciousness temporarily separated from his physical form, allowing him to observe the universe from perspectives that transcended normal spatial and temporal limitations. The return of consciousness to his physical form marked his complete transformation into a champion of Hermaeus Mora. Though the process left him fundamentally changed in ways that made continued existence in normal society impossible. His enhanced perception allowed him to see through the illusions that make normal life bearable for mortals, revealing the cosmic horror that underlies everyday existence. Until then, Shadow Man, wandering around in the darkness of night, disappearing from the depths of the ocean, shadows, arm's length, and cosmic light. There, the shadows melted into darkness. The hands grouped by each one until she was ready to start. Don't be afraid, Shadow Man. That dark secret is now underground and has entered into the south of night. Only shadows melted into darkness. Shadows melted into darkness. Shadows melted into darkness. Do not grow. He could no longer find meaning in conventional pursuits or derive satisfaction from simple pleasures. Instead, experiencing constant awareness of the infinite complexity and fundamental meaninglessness of existence. The case of an imperial mage demonstrates how Hermaeus Mora adapts his champion development techniques to exploit the specific psychological vulnerabilities of different cultural backgrounds. This mage possessed exceptional talent for illusion magic, combined with scholarly interests in the theoretical foundations of magical practice, making him an ideal candidate for corruption through promises of enhanced understanding about the nature of reality itself. His initial contact with Hermaeus Mora occurred through a black book discovered in ancient ruins, where he had been investigating reports of consciousness transfer experiments. The knowledge contained within the Black Book provided theoretical frameworks for understanding illusion magic that revolutionized his spellcrafting capabilities, while introducing concepts about the relationship between perception and reality that gradually undermined his confidence in the stability of existence. The text revealed that conventional illusion spells merely exploited natural inconsistencies in mortal perception rather than creating genuine alterations to reality, suggesting that all experience might be fundamentally illusory in nature. This philosophical revelation created profound uncertainty about the reliability of his own senses and memories. The progression involved systematic exposure to increasingly complex illusion techniques, that blurred the boundaries between magic and reality manipulation. Hermaeus Mora provided him with spell-crafting knowledge that allowed him to create illusions indistinguishable from genuine experiences, even to the caster himself, raising disturbing questions about whether his enhanced abilities represented genuine magical advancement or elaborate self-deception. The social consequences of champion development extend beyond individual transformation to include broader impacts on the communities and institutions that these individuals previously served. Champions typically abandon their former responsibilities and relationships as their enhanced understanding makes normal concerns seem trivial and meaningless. The sudden departure or dramatic personality changes of key figures often trigger investigations that risk exposing Hermaeus Mora's activities to authorities who might attempt to interfere with his recruitment operations. Academic institutions face particular challenges when dealing with supernatural corruption of their members. Colleagues initially attributed increasingly erratic behavior and abandonment of teaching responsibilities to stress or mental illness, attempting various conventional treatments before recognizing the supernatural nature of the condition. Investigations revealed the black books responsible for corruption, but attempts to study or contain these artifacts resulted in additional cases of knowledge addiction among researchers. The phenomenon of knowledge addiction represents one of the most insidious aspects of Hermaeus Mora's champion development process, creating psychological dependencies that prove extremely difficult to treat through conventional means. Unlike physical addictions that affect specific neurotransmitter systems, knowledge addiction involves fundamental alterations to the reward mechanisms that drive intellectual curiosity and learning behavior. Affected individuals experience intense cravings for new information that conventional sources cannot satisfy, leading to increasingly desperate attempts to access forbidden knowledge, regardless of personal or social costs. The neurological changes include enhanced memory formation capabilities that allow champions to retain vast amounts of information with perfect clarity. But these improvements come with corresponding deficits in emotional processing and social cognition. Champions gradually lose the ability to form meaningful emotional connections with other mortals, while retaining intellectual appreciation for abstract concepts. This creates a form of high-functioning sociopathy, where champions can simulate normal emotional responses while experiencing them as purely theoretical constructs rather than genuine feelings. The physical manifestations include changes to brain structure that can be detected through magical examination techniques. Affected individuals develop enlarged regions associated with memory formation and pattern recognition, while showing decreased activity in areas responsible for emotional regulation and social behavior. These changes appear to be progressive and irreversible. The case of an alchemist during a later era provides detailed documentation of the physical progression of knowledge addiction. As her transformation was carefully monitored by colleagues who initially hoped to study her condition for academic purposes, her exposure to forbidden alchemical knowledge through dreams and visions gradually enhanced her understanding of transmutation principles while creating compulsive behaviors centered on acquiring increasingly rare and dangerous ingredients. The early stages manifested as enhanced creativity and problem-solving abilities that allowed her to develop innovative alchemical techniques exceeding anything achieved through conventional research methods. Her colleagues initially viewed these improvements as positive developments that demonstrated exceptional talent rather than supernatural corruption. The intermediate stage involved the development of compulsive research behaviors that gradually consumed all aspects of her life outside her alchemical work. She began spending days at a time in her laboratory without eating or sleeping, sustained entirely by her obsession with completing increasingly complex experimental procedures that seemed to serve no practical purpose. The advanced stage typically involves complete loss of interest in normal mortal concerns, combined with supernatural abilities that exceed conventional magical limitations. Champions at this level often develop the capacity to perceive hidden connections between seemingly unrelated phenomena, predict future events with uncanny accuracy, and manipulate probability through focused application of their enhanced understanding. Her final transformation occurred when her alchemical experiments began producing effects that violated fundamental principles of magical theory, creating substances that possessed properties impossible according to conventional understanding of transmutation mechanics. Her enhanced knowledge allowed her to manipulate matter at levels that exceeded normal alchemical capabilities, but the techniques required gradually separated her consciousness from normal reality. Her colleagues found her laboratory filled with impossible alchemical products, but her physical body reduced to a desiccated shell that retained minimal awareness of the material world. The recruitment strategies employed by Hermaeus Mora for identifying potential champions demonstrate sophisticated understanding of mortal psychology and the specific personality traits that make individuals susceptible to knowledge addiction. The Daedric Prince typically targets scholars who have reached the limits of conventional learning within their fields, particularly those who display frustration with institutional limitations or obsessive tendencies that drive them to pursue understanding, regardless of personal cost. These individuals often possess exceptional intellectual capabilities combined with personality flaws that make them vulnerable to supernatural manipulation. The selection process involves careful observation of academic institutions, magical colleges, and research organizations to identify candidates who meet specific psychological criteria. Hermaeus Mora's agents monitor scholarly publications, attend academic conferences, and infiltrate educational institutions to gather intelligence about promising individuals whose work demonstrates both exceptional capability and dangerous ambition. The identification process can continue for years before initial contact occurs, allowing for comprehensive psychological profiling that enables customized corruption approaches tailored to each candidate's specific vulnerabilities and interests. The timing of initial contact typically coincides with periods of intellectual frustration or professional crisis, when potential champions are most vulnerable to offers of supernatural assistance. Hermaeus Mora often waits until candidates encounter seemingly insurmountable research problems or face institutional obstacles that threaten their academic careers before providing the knowledge necessary to overcome these challenges. This timing creates powerful psychological associations between the Daedric Prince's assistance and professional success. The corruption techniques employed during champion development vary significantly based on the individual's cultural background, academic discipline, and personality traits, but they consistently follow gradual escalation patterns that avoid triggering immediate resistance or suspicion. Initial contact typically involves seemingly coincidental discoveries of useful information rather than direct supernatural manifestation. This approach preserves the individual's sense of agency and accomplishment, while gradually introducing dependencies that become increasingly difficult to abandon. The role of pride in facilitating champion corruption cannot be overstated, as Hermaeus Mora consistently exploits intellectual arrogance and competitive instincts to drive individuals toward increasingly dangerous knowledge acquisition. Champions typically begin their transformation convinced that their enhanced understanding demonstrates superior intellectual capabilities, rather than supernatural corruption, making them resistant to warnings from colleagues or authorities who attempt to intervene. This pride creates psychological barriers that prevent champions from recognizing their condition until the corruption process has progressed beyond the point where conventional treatment methods might prove effective. The ultimate fate of mortal champions who complete their transformation into servants of Hermaeus Mora varies depending on their specific capabilities and the prince's current needs, but it typically involves some form of integration into Apocrypha's eternal operations rather than continued existence in the mortal realm. Champions who possess exceptional research abilities often become permanent residents of the Infinite Library, serving as specialized librarians and researchers who catalog and analyze new knowledge acquisitions. Those with particular expertise in specific subjects may be assigned to oversee dedicated sections of Apocrypha that focus on their areas of specialization. The transformation process that converts mortal champions into apocryphal entities involves gradual replacement of their physical forms with constructs better suited to existence within Hermaeus Mora's realm. This process typically begins with enhanced sensory capabilities that allow champions to perceive information through methods unavailable to normal mortals. These enhancements initially appear beneficial, improving the champion's research capabilities, while creating dependencies on supernatural abilities that make return to normal existence increasingly difficult. The psychological aspects prove even more profound than the physical changes, as champions gradually lose the emotional and social connections that define human identity, while retaining intellectual capabilities that serve Hermaeus Mora's purposes. The process preserves memories and personality traits that make individuals effective researchers, while eliminating concerns about mortal relationships, physical comfort, or personal autonomy that might interfere with their dedication to knowledge acquisition. The result creates beings that retain enough of their original identity to function effectively, while becoming completely devoted to serving their Daedric master's agenda. The few documented cases of champions who attempted to resist or reverse their transformation reveal the extreme difficulty of escaping Hermaeus Mora's influence once the corruption process reaches advanced stages. These individuals typically retain enough self-awareness to recognize their condition and desire freedom, but their enhanced understanding of cosmic reality makes normal existence seem meaningless and unbearable. The knowledge they have gained cannot be forgotten or ignored, creating permanent alterations to their consciousness that persist regardless of their emotional desires to return to their former lives. Now let's explore the relationship between Hermaeus Mora and prophetic knowledge, which extends far beyond simple fortune-telling to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of time, causality, and the degree to which future events can be influenced by present actions. Unlike other forms of forbidden knowledge that deal with historical facts or theoretical concepts, prophecy involves information about events that have not yet occurred. This creates unique challenges for a Daedric prince whose sphere traditionally focuses on accumulating and preserving existing wisdom. The intersection between Hermaeus Mora's domain and prophetic knowledge reveals complex philosophical tensions about whether the future exists as a fixed reality waiting to be discovered, or as a fluid possibility that changes based on the observer's knowledge of potential outcomes. The earliest documented connection between Hermaeus Mora and prophetic traditions emerges from pre-imperial practices that treated divination as a form of knowledge acquisition rather than supernatural revelation. Ancient seers approached prophecy through systematic observation of natural patterns, interpreting animal behavior, weather phenomena, and astronomical events as indicators of future trends rather than relying on direct divine communication. This methodical approach to prediction aligned closely with Hermaeus Mora's preference for accumulating information through careful study, making these early diviners natural candidates for his influence during eras when his sphere was still primarily associated with woodland wisdom and practical knowledge. The transformation of these early divination practices under Hermaeus Mora's influence involved gradual introduction of techniques that enhanced predictive accuracy while creating psychological dependencies on supernatural guidance. Seers who accepted his assistance found their natural abilities amplified through access to information about historical patterns that normal observation could never reveal. However, this enhanced capability came with corresponding losses in their ability to distinguish between natural divination and supernatural manipulation, gradually undermining their confidence in their own judgment, while increasing their reliance on Daedric guidance. The development of written prophecy, as distinct from oral divination traditions, created new opportunities for Hermaeus Mora to influence prophetic knowledge through manipulation of texts and documents, rather than direct contact with individual seers. Written prophecies possessed several advantages from the prince's perspective, including greater permanence that allowed for long-term planning and enhanced potential for deliberate ambiguity. The shift toward written prophecy also created opportunities for retrospective alteration of prophetic texts, allowing Hermaeus Mora to modify predictions after events had occurred to maintain the appearance of supernatural accuracy. The creation of the Elder Scrolls themselves represents perhaps the most significant development in the relationship between prophecy and forbidden knowledge. Though the exact nature of their connection to Hermaeus Mora remains a subject of considerable scholarly debate, these artifacts possess prophetic capabilities that exceed anything achieved through conventional divination methods. Only shadows melting into darkness, displaying the ability to reveal future events with perfect accuracy, while simultaneously existing outside normal temporal constraints. On one hand, the scrolls represent the ultimate repository of prophetic knowledge, containing information about future events that cannot be obtained through any other means. The prince's natural inclination toward accumulating all forms of knowledge makes the Elder Scrolls extremely attractive targets for acquisition or influence. However, the scroll's tendency to exist outside normal causal relationships makes them resistant to conventional manipulation techniques, while their prophetic accuracy depends partly on remaining independent of external control. The phenomenon of Elder Scroll blindness provides crucial insights into the relationship between prophetic knowledge and mortal consciousness, revealing fundamental limitations in how human minds can process information about future events. Readers who attempt to extract prophetic information from Elder Scrolls typically experience progressive vision loss that appears to result from exposure to temporal paradoxes rather than simple magical effects. The blindness develops gradually as readers gain access to increasingly detailed information about future events, suggesting that mortal consciousness cannot safely accommodate knowledge that violates normal causal relationships. The connection between Elder Scroll blindness and other forms of knowledge-induced madness reveals patterns that suggest common underlying mechanisms affecting all mortals who gain access to information beyond their natural cognitive capacity. The moth priests who serve as professional readers of Elder Scrolls represent one of the most successful attempts to create sustainable methods for accessing prophetic knowledge without complete destruction of the individuals involved. Their techniques involve gradual conditioning that prepares readers for exposure to temporal paradoxes, while providing support systems that help manage the psychological and physical consequences of prophetic revelation. The Moth Priest tradition demonstrates that careful preparation and institutional support can extend the useful lifespan of prophetic readers, though even these methods cannot prevent eventual blindness and other forms of cognitive deterioration. The relationship between moth priests and Hermaeus Mora creates complex tensions within religious hierarchies, as the prince's influence on prophetic traditions conflicts with official policies regarding Daedric worship. Individual moth priests often find themselves exposed to forbidden knowledge through their work with Elder Scrolls, creating vulnerabilities that Hermaeus Mora can exploit to gain influence within important religious institutions. However, the collective nature of moth priest training and the institutional oversight provided by their order create barriers that limit the prince's ability to corrupt individual readers without detection. The case of one particular moth priest illustrates both the opportunities and limitations that Hermaeus Mora faces when attempting to influence Elder Scroll readers. This priest's exceptional talent for interpreting prophetic texts made him valuable to imperial authorities who relied on his readings for strategic planning during major crises. However, his prolonged exposure to Elder Scrolls gradually created psychological vulnerabilities that Hermaeus Mora exploited through carefully timed revelations that enhanced his interpretive abilities, while introducing subtle biases into his prophetic readings. The corruption process involved providing supplementary knowledge that helped him understand the historical context surrounding prophetic events, allowing him to produce more detailed and useful interpretations than his colleagues could achieve. This enhanced capability earned him recognition and advancement within the Moth Priest hierarchy, while creating dependencies on supernatural guidance. The discovery of his corruption by fellow Moth Priests revealed the sophisticated methods that Hermaeus Mora employs to infiltrate prophetic institutions without triggering institutional defenses. Rather than attempting direct recruitment or obvious supernatural intervention, the prince worked through gradual enhancement of existing capabilities that appeared to result from natural talent development. The broader implications of Hermaeus Mora's influence on prophetic traditions extend beyond individual corruption cases to encompass systematic manipulation of how mortal societies understand and respond to future threats. By influencing key prophetic readers and institutions, the prince can shape collective responses to predicted events while maintaining plausible deniability regarding his involvement. This indirect approach to historical manipulation proves more effective than direct intervention because it works through established channels of authority and expertise that mortals naturally trust. The role of prophecy in legitimizing political authority creates additional opportunities for Hermaeus Mora to influence historical events through manipulation of prophetic traditions. Throughout history, rulers have relied on prophetic validation to justify their actions and maintain popular support, making prophetic institutions crucial components of political stability. By influencing the interpretation of prophetic texts or the selection of which prophecies receive official recognition, Hermaeus Mora can indirectly shape political decisions while appearing to respect mortal autonomy and free will. The dragon break phenomena represent extreme examples of how prophetic knowledge can become destabilized when multiple conflicting interpretations of future events achieve simultaneous validity. These temporal anomalies typically occur when different groups attempt to use prophetic knowledge to achieve contradictory objectives, creating paradoxes that fracture normal causal relationships. The role of Hermaeus Mora during Dragon Break events remains unclear, but circumstantial evidence suggests that his influence on prophetic traditions may contribute to the conditions that make such temporal anomalies possible. The preservation of prophetic texts during Dragon Break events reveals Hermaeus Mora's priorities regarding different types of knowledge and their relative importance to his long-term objectives. While many historical records become confused or contradictory during temporal anomalies, prophetic texts often emerge from dragon breaks with enhanced rather than diminished accuracy. This pattern indicates that Hermaeus Mora views prophetic knowledge as sufficiently valuable to justify direct intervention during periods of temporal instability. The relationship between prophecy and historical inevitability creates fundamental philosophical tensions within Hermaeus Mora's sphere that affect how he approaches the acquisition and dissemination of prophetic knowledge. If future events are truly predetermined, then prophetic knowledge represents simple information gathering rather than reality manipulation. However, if prophecy involves knowledge that can change based on mortal actions. Then, prophetic texts become tools for influencing reality, rather than neutral repositories of information. The resolution of this philosophical tension appears to involve treating prophecy as a form of conditional knowledge that reveals potential futures based on current trends, while remaining subject to modification through deliberate intervention. This approach allows Hermaeus Mora to maintain his role as neutral keeper of information, while simultaneously using prophetic knowledge as a tool for influencing historical events. By providing selective access to prophetic information, the prince can guide mortal decisions toward outcomes that serve his interests, while maintaining the appearance of respecting free will and natural causation. The development of artificial prophecy through magical techniques represents an attempt to bypass the limitations and dangers associated with natural prophetic abilities, while maintaining access to information about future events. These techniques typically involve systematic analysis of historical patterns, combined with magical enhancement of pattern recognition capabilities. However, the accuracy of artificial prophecy depends heavily on access to comprehensive historical information, creating opportunities for Hermaeus Mora to influence predictions through selective provision of historical knowledge. Academic institutions developed some of the most sophisticated artificial prophecy techniques, using mathematical analysis of historical patterns to predict future political and economic trends with remarkable accuracy. Their methods involved collecting vast amounts of historical data and applying complex analytical techniques that identified recurring patterns and cyclical trends. However, the effectiveness of these techniques depended on access to accurate historical information, making researchers vulnerable to manipulation through provision of selectively edited or enhanced historical knowledge. The infiltration of academic prophecy programs by Hermaeus Mora's agents demonstrates the prince's long-term commitment to controlling prophetic knowledge through institutional capture rather than individual corruption. By placing servants in key positions within universities and research institutions, the prince can influence the development of prophetic techniques while maintaining plausible deniability. Waiting for the final piece definitely is in doubt. Doubt, fear, and just wonder. What do you think? These agents typically focus on enhancing the accuracy of institutional prophecy programs through provision of superior historical information, creating dependencies that gradually align institutional objectives with Hermaeus Mora's agenda. The case of one professor illustrates how institutional infiltration can be used to shape entire academic disciplines over extended periods. This scholar spent decades developing theoretical frameworks for understanding prophetic phenomena, while secretly receiving guidance from Hermaeus Mora through dreams and visions that enhanced her research capabilities. Her published works became standard references for prophetic studies throughout the empire, establishing theoretical foundations that subtly incorporated assumptions and methodologies that served the prince's interests while appearing to represent objective academic scholarship. The influence of Hermaeus Mora's theoretical frameworks on prophetic studies created ripple effects that extended far beyond individual academic institutions to shape how entire generations of scholars approached prophetic phenomena. Students trained using these methods developed analytical techniques that unconsciously aligned with Hermaeus Mora's preferences. This educational influence created networks of scholars throughout the empire who served the prince's interests without conscious awareness of their role in his larger agenda. The corruption of prophetic traditions through academic channels proves particularly effective because it works through established systems of knowledge transmission that mortals naturally trust and respect. Unlike direct supernatural intervention that might trigger resistance or suspicion, academic corruption appears to result from natural scholarly development and peer review processes that validate new ideas based on their apparent merit rather than their supernatural origins. The Fourth Era has witnessed an unprecedented expansion of Hermaeus Mora's influence throughout the world, driven by the confluence of political upheaval, magical instability, and the systematic corruption of scholarly institutions that had previously served as bastions against Daedric infiltration. Civil wars, the collapse of magical guilds, and the emergence of new centers of magical learning have created opportunities for the Prince of Knowledge to establish deeper footholds in mortal society. The dissolution of established magical institutions following various crises created a power vacuum in magical education that Hermaeus Mora has systematically exploited through the establishment of alternative learning institutions that appear to serve legitimate educational purposes, while actually functioning as recruitment centers for potential servants. Academic institutions, despite their official independence from Daedric influence, have become particular focuses of his attention due to their isolation, desperate need for resources, and the ambitious nature of faculty members who seek to restore their institution's former prestige through increasingly dangerous research projects. The infiltration began subtly through the donation of rare texts and artifacts that enhanced institutional research capabilities, while introducing faculty members to concepts that gradually align their academic priorities with Hermaeus Mora's interests. These materials typically appeared through seemingly legitimate channels, often presented as gifts from anonymous benefactors or discoveries made during archaeological expeditions. The enhanced resources allowed researchers to pursue projects that would have been impossible with their limited official funding, creating dependencies that made them reluctant to investigate the true sources of their newfound prosperity. One professor's research into soul gem enhancement techniques exemplifies how Hermaeus Mora's influence has shaped academic priorities at major institutions. This scholar's work initially focused on conventional enchantment theory, but access to advanced texts provided through anonymous donations led him to explore increasingly esoteric aspects of soul manipulation that push the boundaries of accepted magical practice. His enhanced understanding of soul gem mechanics allowed him to develop techniques that significantly improved enchantment efficiency, earning him recognition within the magical community while creating psychological dependencies on the supernatural knowledge sources that made his breakthroughs possible. The transformation of this researcher's interests followed patterns characteristic of Hermaeus Mora's corruption techniques, beginning with practical improvements to existing magical techniques and gradually evolving toward theoretical investigations that served no apparent purpose beyond satisfying intellectual curiosity. His later work focused on questions about the fundamental nature of souls and their relationship to consciousness, research that required access to increasingly dangerous materials and techniques while providing insights that had no practical applications within conventional magical practice. The shift from practical enchantment research to abstract theoretical investigation reflected the gradual reorientation of his priorities away from serving institutional needs toward pursuing knowledge for its own sake. Similar patterns can be observed throughout academic institutions across the world as Hermaeus Mora's influence spreads through networks of corrupted scholars and researchers who unknowingly serve his agenda while believing they are advancing legitimate academic knowledge. The prince's patient, methodical approach to institutional infiltration has proven remarkably effective, creating lasting changes to academic culture that will persist long after individual corrupted scholars have completed their transformations. The establishment of new centers of learning in remote locations has provided additional opportunities for Hermaeus Mora to influence magical education from its foundations. Rather than attempting to corrupt existing institutions with established traditions and oversight mechanisms, these new academies often attract ambitious scholars who are frustrated with the limitations of traditional institutions and eager to explore forbidden areas of research. The promise of unlimited resources and freedom to pursue any area of study proves irresistible to many academics who have spent years struggling against institutional restrictions and limited funding. However, these apparent advantages come with subtle costs that gradually transform enthusiastic researchers into devoted servants of the Prince of Knowledge. The corruption of prophetic traditions continues to be a major focus of Hermaeus Mora's Fourth Era activities. As political instability and magical upheaval have created increased demand for prophetic guidance among both rulers and common citizens. The collapse of traditional prophetic institutions has left a vacuum that the prince has been quick to fill through the establishment of alternative sources of prophetic knowledge. Independent seers and diviners who lack the institutional training and support systems that previously protected moth priests and similar professionals prove particularly vulnerable to Hermaeus Mora's influence. These individuals often possess genuine prophetic abilities, but lack the knowledge and experience necessary to recognize and resist supernatural manipulation. The prince typically approaches such individuals during periods of crisis when their prophetic abilities are in high demand, but their confidence in their own capabilities may be shaken by the magnitude of the events they are attempting to predict. By providing enhanced accuracy and additional insights, Hermaeus Mora can quickly establish dependencies that lead to complete corruption over time. The proliferation of written prophetic texts during this era has created additional vectors for the prince's influence. As desperate individuals seek answers to unprecedented questions through any available sources. Many of these texts are genuine prophecies that have been subtly altered to serve Hermaeus Mora's purposes, while others are entirely fabricated documents designed to spread specific ideas or influence particular decisions. The difficulty of verifying prophetic accuracy until events have actually occurred makes this form of manipulation particularly effective, as readers have no immediate way to distinguish between genuine prophecies and carefully crafted deceptions. The political implications of Hermaeus Mora's expanded influence during the Fourth Era extend far beyond individual corruption cases to encompass systematic manipulation of major historical events through carefully orchestrated campaigns of information management and prophetic guidance. By influencing key advisors, scholars, and prophetic readers who counsel political leaders, the prince has gained unprecedented ability to shape policy decisions and strategic planning at the highest levels of government. This influence typically manifests through the provision of accurate but incomplete information that guides decision-makers toward choices that serve Hermaeus Mora's long-term objectives. The prince's patient, methodical approach to historical manipulation means that the full implications of his Fourth Era activities may not become apparent for generations. The seeds of future conflicts and transformations are being planted through seemingly minor decisions and policy changes that will have cascading effects throughout the coming centuries. The corruption of magical research and development during this era has also created new categories of forbidden knowledge that exceed even the dangerous texts found in traditional black books. These innovations typically emerge from academic institutions that have fallen under Hermaeus Mora's influence, where researchers with enhanced abilities and access to supernatural knowledge sources can pursue projects that would be impossible through conventional means. The resulting discoveries often prove too dangerous for practical application, but they serve the prince's purposes by advancing theoretical understanding in areas that align with his interests, while creating additional opportunities for corrupting new generations of scholars and researchers. The social and cultural implications of Hermaeus Mora's expanded influence are perhaps most visible in the changing nature of intellectual discourse and academic culture throughout the civilized world. Scholarly communities that were once characterized by open debate and collaborative research have gradually become more secretive and competitive as individual researchers hoard knowledge and pursue personal advancement rather than contributing to collective understanding. This shift reflects the prince's influence on academic values and priorities, as corrupted scholars unconsciously spread attitudes and behaviors that align with Hermaeus Mora's preferences for knowledge accumulation over knowledge sharing. The long-term consequences of these cultural changes may prove even more significant than the immediate effects of individual corruption cases. The establishment of secret societies and exclusive research groups within academic institutions has provided additional mechanisms for the prince to control and direct scholarly activities. These organizations typically present themselves as elite circles of advanced researchers who have access to superior knowledge sources and research methods. In reality, they serve as recruitment and indoctrination centers where promising scholars are gradually introduced to increasingly dangerous and corrupting forms of knowledge. The exclusivity and prestige associated with membership in these groups makes them particularly effective tools for identifying and corrupting individuals who possess the intellectual capabilities and psychological vulnerabilities that Hermaeus Mora seeks in his servants. The proliferation of these secret societies throughout academic institutions represents one of the most concerning developments of the Fourth Era, as it suggests that the prince's influence has reached a level of institutionalization that may be extremely difficult to reverse through conventional means. The technological and magical innovations that have emerged during this period of expanded Daedric influence often incorporate principles and techniques that blur the boundaries between legitimate research and forbidden knowledge. These developments typically begin with seemingly beneficial applications that address practical needs or solve important problems. Spot, however, the underlying principles often derive from supernatural sources that gradually corrupt both the technologies themselves and the individuals who work with them. The widespread adoption of these innovations creates networks of dependency and influence that extend Hermaeus Mora's reach far beyond traditional academic and scholarly communities. The economic implications of these developments are particularly significant, as entire industries and trade networks have begun to rely on technologies and techniques that ultimately derive from Daedric sources. This economic integration makes it extremely difficult for societies to reject or eliminate Hermaeus Mora's influence without accepting significant material costs and disruptions. The prince's understanding of mortal psychology and social dynamics allows him to create situations where the benefits of accepting his influence appear to outweigh the risks, at least in the short term. This approach has proven remarkably effective at overcoming traditional resistance to Daedric corruption and has enabled the prince to achieve levels of integration into mortal society that would have been impossible through more direct methods. The educational implications of Hermaeus Mora's Fourth Era expansion are perhaps most concerning for the long-term future of mortal civilization. Entire generations of scholars and researchers are being trained using methodologies and theoretical frameworks that subtly incorporate Daedric influences and assumptions. These educational approaches produce graduates who are predisposed to accept and seek out forbidden knowledge while viewing such pursuits as natural extensions of legitimate scholarly inquiry. The cumulative effect of these educational changes may fundamentally alter the character of intellectual culture throughout the civilized world. The prince's influence on educational curricula and academic standards has been particularly subtle but effective, as changes are typically implemented gradually through seemingly reasonable reforms and improvements that appear to enhance rather than corrupt educational quality. However, these modifications consistently move educational systems toward approaches that emphasize individual knowledge acquisition over collaborative learning, theoretical understanding over practical application, and abstract concepts over concrete skills. These shifts align perfectly with Hermaeus Mora's preferences, while appearing to represent natural evolution in educational methodology. The religious and spiritual implications of the prince's expanded influence during the Fourth Era represent perhaps the greatest long-term threat to traditional mortal values and beliefs. As Hermaeus Mora's corruption spreads through academic and intellectual communities, it inevitably affects the theological and philosophical foundations that underpin organized religion and spiritual practice. Religious institutions that once served as bastions against Daedric influence find themselves increasingly compromised by corrupted scholars and theologians who introduce subtle changes to doctrine and practice. These modifications typically appear as reasonable adaptations to contemporary circumstances, or as scholarly refinements of traditional teachings. However, they consistently move religious thought toward perspectives that are compatible with Hermaeus Mora's sphere of influence, while undermining the spiritual foundations that previously provided protection against Daedric corruption. The long-term consequences of these religious and spiritual changes may prove even more devastating than the immediate effects of political and academic corruption. And so we come to the end of our journey through the dark and twisted realm of Hermaeus Mora's influence. From the ancient woodland man of forgotten forests to the cosmic horror that rules over infinite libraries of forbidden knowledge, we've seen how the Prince of Knowledge has evolved and adapted his methods across millennia. We've explored the transformation of scholars into tentacled horrors, the corruption of entire academic institutions, the creation of artifacts so dangerous that merely reading them can drive mortals to madness, and the systematic infiltration of prophetic traditions that shape the very course of history itself. Perhaps most disturbing of all, we've seen how Hermaeus Mora's influence continues to expand in our current era, spreading through networks of corrupted knowledge and corrupted minds, creating dependencies that make resistance increasingly difficult and costly. The Prince of Knowledge offers the ultimate temptation, the promise of understanding everything, of having access to every secret, every hidden truth, every forbidden mystery. But as we've learned today, some prices are too high to pay, and some knowledge is too dangerous to possess. The next time you find yourself frustrated by the limitations of conventional learning, the next time you wish you could know more than your studies allow, remember the fate of Mirac. Remember the scribes of Apocrypha. Remember all those scholars who thought they could handle just a little forbidden knowledge and ended up losing everything that made them human. Knowledge is power, but power without wisdom leads only to corruption and madness. And in the infinite libraries of Apocrypha, surrounded by books that breathe and tentacles that think, wisdom is the first thing to be consumed by the hungry darkness of absolute knowledge. That's all for today's dive into Elder Scrolls lore. If you enjoyed learning about the terrifying depths of Hermaeus Mora's influence, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the darkest corners of Tamriel's history. What other Daedric princes would you like to see covered in future videos? Let me know in the comments below. And remember, some doors are better left unopened, and some books are better left unread. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. But until then, keep your eyes open for those mysterious tomes that appear when you need answers the most. You never know who might be watching from the other side of the page.